When the gardener walked in, everything changed. What began as a routine visit to care for my garden turned into a story that would transform both our lives forever. This is a tale of unexpected connection, self-discovery, and love that defied convention. Before we dive into this emotionally charged story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this one. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had spent the morning reading on the patio, the late spring sun filtering through the trees that bordered my yard. My life at 65 had settled into a predictable rhythm, quiet, solitary, and, to my surprise, content. I had long given up on the idea of love. It wasn't something I actively avoided. It just felt like a closed chapter of my life. The sound of the gate opening startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. Standing at the entrance was the new gardener, a tall man in his early 30s with skin the color of rich mahogany. His presence was commanding, but his smile, warm and unassuming, softened him. He carried himself with an ease that made me feel immediately at a loss for words. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard as he stepped forward. "I'm Daniel, here to take care of your garden." I nodded, trying to mask the sudden nervousness that had gripped me. "Welcome, Daniel. Everything you need should be in the shed. Let me know if you require anything." He smiled again, this time a little wider, and headed toward the tools. I sat back in my chair, but my book no longer held my attention. Instead, my eyes followed him as he worked, his tall frame moving with purpose as he trimmed the hedges and cleared the flower beds. It wasn't just his appearance that drew me in, though I couldn't deny the quiet magnetism he carried. It was the way he seemed so at ease in his surroundings, as if he belonged there in my garden more than I ever had. The hours passed quickly, and as Daniel gathered his tools to leave, he approached me again. "Your garden has great potential," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It's a bit overgrown, but with some care, it could be beautiful again." I chuckled, gesturing to the yard. I suppose that makes two of us. A bit overgrown, but still some potential. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that made something stir within me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Then I guess I'll see you next week, Mr. Harris." "Call me Henry," I said quickly, surprising even myself. He nodded, his smile lingering as he walked back through the gate. That night, I found myself replaying the day's events in my mind. There was nothing remarkable about our interaction, yet it felt significant in a way I couldn't explain. It had been years since anyone had made me feel noticed, alive, even in the smallest of ways. I told myself it was nothing, just the warmth of his smile and the pleasantness of his presence. But deep down, I knew better. Something about Daniel had unsettled the quiet stillness of my life, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what that meant. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, was this just the passing charm of someone new, or was it the beginning of something I hadn't dared to hope for? The following week, Daniel returned. I was sitting on the patio again, pretending to read, but my mind was elsewhere. I had spent the past few days convincing myself that my reaction to him was a fleeting moment of admiration. Nothing more. But as soon as I heard the creak of the garden gate, my pulse quickened. "Good morning, Henry." He greeted me with that same easy smile as he carried his tools to the shed. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied, surprised by how natural his name felt on my lips. As he worked, I couldn't help but watch him. He moved with the same quiet focus, his hands deftly pruning overgrown branches and coaxing life back into the neglected garden. It was mesmerizing in a way I hadn't expected, and before I knew it, I found myself standing closer to him than I intended. "Do you enjoy gardening?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking through my thoughts. I hesitated. "Not particularly," I admitted. "My late wife cared for the garden. I've let it go since she passed." Daniel paused, turning to look at me. His expression wasn't one of pity, but of understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "I can see she had an eye for beauty. These roses, they're resilient. With the right care, they'll bloom again." His words felt like they carried a double meaning, and I wasn't sure if he realized it. "Resilient," I repeated, almost to myself. "Yes, I suppose they are." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's presence became a steady rhythm in my life. He would arrive each Tuesday, and our conversations grew longer. We spoke about the garden, of course, but also about his life. He told me he had grown up in a small town, raised by his grandmother, who had taught him everything he knew about plants. "She always said a garden reflects its caretaker," he shared one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you tend to it with love, it flourishes." "She sounds like a wise woman," I replied, watching him closely. "And do you believe that? About gardens reflecting their caretakers?" He smiled, his gaze meeting mine briefly before returning to his work. "I do." It was during one of these quiet afternoons that something shifted. Daniel was working near the patio, pulling weeds, when the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm came quickly, and I rushed to help him gather his tools before the rain began to fall. As we hurried toward the shed, the first drops began to fall. We made it just in time, the door slamming shut behind us. Inside, the air was warm and close, filled with the faint scent of soil and grass. We both laughed at the suddenness of the storm, our breaths coming in short bursts. "Guess I'm stuck here for a while," Daniel said, glancing at the rain pelting against the small window. "It seems so," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The shed felt impossibly small, and I was acutely aware of how close we were. Daniel leaned against the wall, his dark eyes meeting mine. There was something in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper. It was as if he could see through the years I had spent building walls around myself. "Henry," he said softly, his voice like a tether pulling me back to reality. "Are you okay?" I nodded quickly, breaking eye contact. "Yes, just not used to company, I suppose." Daniel smiled, but it was softer this time. "Well, I'm glad to be here." The rain eventually slowed, and Daniel gathered his things to leave. But as he stepped through the gate, he turned back, his smile lingering. "See you next week, Henry." I stood there for a long time after he left, the rain still dripping from the eaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something unspoken but undeniably present. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what that meant. The following Tuesday, I found myself anticipating Daniel's arrival more than I cared to admit. I had spent the morning pacing the garden, wondering why his presence lingered in my mind so heavily. At 65, I had thought the days of feeling a thrill from someone's company were far behind me. And yet, there I was, waiting like a man half my age, when the gate creaked open and Daniel stepped through. The familiar flutter in my chest returned. He greeted me with his usual warmth, his deep voice carrying across the garden like a melody I couldn't ignore. "Good morning, Henry," he said, his smile as genuine as ever. "Morning, Daniel," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "The garden's looking better each week." "That's all you," he said, glancing at the thriving flowers and neatly trimmed hedges. "You've kept me inspired." I couldn't help but laugh softly. "I doubt I've done much, but thank you." That day the air seemed heavier, charged with something unspoken. We worked together more closely than usual, Daniel encouraging me to join him in pruning some of the overgrown roses. I hesitated at first, but his patient guidance made it easy. "You're a natural," he said, his hands brushing against mine as he showed me the proper way to hold the shears. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple through me I couldn't ignore. I looked up at him, his face so close that I could see the faint scar near his temple, the beads of sweat on his brow. For a moment the world seemed to tilt, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Daniel didn't seem to notice my reaction, or if he did, he didn't let on. Instead, he continued with an ease that made me feel both comforted and unsettled. As the afternoon wore on, we sat together on the patio, enjoying the shade and a pitcher of iced tea I had prepared. The conversation turned more personal than it ever had before. Daniel opened up about his struggles, how he had spent years trying to prove himself in a world that often underestimated him because of his skin color and his humble beginnings. "It's not easy," he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically somber. "But I've learned to focus on what I can control. My work, my attitude. That's what keeps me grounded." I listened intently, his words striking a chord deep within me. "You're remarkable, Daniel," I said quietly. "I don't know if I could have endured what you have." He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You've endured your own battles, Henry. I can see it." I didn't know how to respond. His words felt like an invitation to open up, to share the parts of myself I had kept locked away for so long. But vulnerability wasn't something I had ever been good at. Later that afternoon, as Daniel packed up to leave, something unexpected happened. He turned to me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen. "Henry, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, my pulse quickening. "Why do you spend so much time out here, alone?" he asked. "You've built this beautiful garden, but it feels like you're keeping it, and yourself, hidden." The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I suppose I've grown comfortable with solitude," I said finally. "It's easier than facing other things." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Sometimes the things we avoid are the things we need the most." His words hung in the air long after he left, echoing in my mind as I sat alone on the patio. He had seen through me in a way no one else had, and it terrified me. But it also stirred something I hadn't felt in years, a desire to be truly seen. As the sun set that evening, I found myself replaying every moment of our time together. The way his hand had brushed against mine, the depth in his voice when he spoke of his struggles, the quiet intensity of his gaze. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, could this be more than I had ever imagined? The sky was heavy with dark clouds when Daniel arrived that week, a sign of an impending storm. I had been restless since our last conversation, replaying his words over and over. His ability to see through my defenses left me both intrigued and unsettled. As he walked into the garden, his usual confidence seemed muted, replaced by something more contemplative. "Looks like we might get rained out today," Daniel said, glancing at the sky as he set his tools down. but I'll do what I can before it starts." "You don't have to push yourself," I replied, feeling a strange urge to protect him from the storm. "It's just a garden." He turned to me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "It's not just a garden, Henry. It's yours, and that makes it worth the effort." The sincerity in his voice left me momentarily speechless. I nodded, unsure of how to respond, and retreated to the patio to watch him work. The storm came quickly, forcing us to take shelter in the shed once again. The space felt even smaller this time, the sound of rain pounding against the roof amplifying the tension between us. Daniel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet today," he said, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. I had spent my life mastering the art of restraint, but something about Daniel made it impossible to hold back. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," I admitted, "about avoiding the things we need most." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. And you're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent years shutting people out, telling myself it was easier that way. But lately, I'm not so sure." He took a step closer, the small distance between us suddenly feeling immense. "What changed?" "You," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop it. The air between us grew thick with unspoken emotions. Daniel's eyes searched mine, as if trying to decipher what I wasn't saying aloud. "Henry," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Before he could finish, a loud crack of thunder interrupted him, making us both jump. We laughed nervously, the moment broken but not forgotten. When the rain finally subsided, Daniel lingered by the gate, his usual confidence giving way to a quiet vulnerability. "I'm glad you told me," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You don't have to shut me out, Henry. I'm here." I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't yet name. "Thank you, Daniel." As he left, I felt the weight of his words settle over me. He wasn't just talking about the garden or the storm. He was talking about us, about the connection that had grown between us, despite my efforts to keep it at bay. That evening, as I sat alone on the patio, I couldn't escape the realization that Daniel had become more than just a gardener or a companion. He had become a mirror, reflecting parts of myself I had long ignored, and as much as it scared me, it also gave me hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't too late to embrace something real. But with that hope came fear. Fear of rejection, fear of misunderstanding, fear of ruining the one thing that had brought color back into my life. And as the storm clouds cleared, I found myself facing the biggest question of all. Was I brave enough to take the risk? The following week, the atmosphere between us was different. There was an unspoken awareness now, a weight in the air that neither of us could ignore. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance, every word, every movement Daniel made as he worked in the garden. He was quieter than usual, his focus seeming deeper, yet every so often his eyes would meet mine, and a flicker of something I couldn't name would pass between us. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to say something, to break the silence that had grown louder since the storm. By mid-afternoon, Daniel paused to take a break, joining me on the patio where I had set out iced tea. The tension was palpable, but I couldn't find the words to ease it. Instead, I handed him a glass, our fingers brushing briefly as he took it. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the faint hum of a distant lawnmower. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Henry, I've been thinking," he began, his tone measured, "about what you said last week." I froze, my heart pounding. "What about it?" He set his glass down, leaning forward slightly. "You said I changed something for you, and I've been wondering if maybe you've done the same for me." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands before returning to mine. "I've spent so much of my life moving from one place to another, always keeping people at arm's length. It was easier that way. But with you, I feel like I can just be myself, and that's rare for me." The vulnerability in his voice was disarming. I felt the walls I had carefully constructed around myself begin to crumble even further. "I feel the same way," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever." Daniel's expression softened, and for a moment we just sat there, the unspoken connection between us growing stronger. Then, as if compelled by something neither of us could resist, he reached out and placed his hand over mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I looked up to find his eyes fixed on mine, searching for permission, for understanding. "Henry," he said softly, "I don't want to cross a line, but—" "You're not," I interrupted, surprising even myself with the firmness in my voice. He smiled, a quiet relief washing over his features. Slowly, he leaned closer, and for the first time in years, I let myself follow my heart instead of my fear. Our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and electric, a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. When we finally pulled away, the world seemed to shift back into focus. But everything felt different now. Lighter, more vivid. Daniel looked at me, his hand still resting over mine. "I've wanted to do that for a while," he admitted, his voice barely above a murmur. "So have I replied, feeling a smile tug at my lips. We sat there for a long time, talking about everything and nothing, the tension that had once filled the air replaced by a newfound sense of ease. For the first time in years, I felt alive, as if the garden around us wasn't the only thing that had been brought back to life. As Daniel left that evening, he paused at the gate, turning back to look at me. "This isn't just a moment for me, Henry," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to know that." I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't yet name. "I know," I said, "and I feel the same." As the gate closed behind him, I sat on the patio, the memory of his touch lingering on my skin. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time I was ready to face it. With him, the days that followed felt like a dream I never thought I'd live. Daniel's visits to the garden were no longer just about tending the roses. They were about tending to something between us, something real, fragile, and breathtaking. One evening as we sat together on the patio, he reached for my hand. "Henry, I don't care about the years between us, or what anyone else might think. I just want to be with you." His words silenced the doubts I had clung to for so long. "I want that too," I said, the certainty in my voice surprising even me. Our relationship blossomed in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. We shared quiet dinners, laughter under the stars, and moments of vulnerability that deepened our bond. The garden, once overgrown and lifeless, mirrored our journey, alive, thriving, and full of promise. As we stood together one evening, watching the sun set over the garden, Daniel wrapped his arm around me. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. I leaned into him, my heart full. Yes, it is. And for the first time in years, I believed it. This story reminds us that love can find us in the most unexpected places and at any stage in life. Have you ever taken a chance on something that scared you, but changed everything? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your story. If this tale touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Together, let's continue celebrating the courage to love and live fully.